I love survival horror, but constantly find myself being let down by a lot of the modern entries. Too many of them recycle the same spooky settings, the same dull enemies, and the same boring characters. As far as I'm concerned, developers who are still making survival horror should sit down and study Narcosis, a slickly produced thriller that doesn't need a haunted mansion or undead monsters to deliver effective scares. I want to see more horror games just like this. Released more than a year ago on PC and Xbox One, Narcosis is finally making its debut on the PlayStation 4, and it's worth the wait. This tells the harrowing story of what happens to a small research team after a nearby earthquake destroys their underwater facility and leaves everybody stranded. You play one of the lucky survivors, who is suddenly forced to fight against all odds in order to escape the depths and find his way back to the surface. This turns out to be a tense and often terrifying ordeal that'll make you never want to work 3,500 meters under the ocean's surface. The good news, if there is any, is that the survivor was in his underwater diving gear when the earthquake hit. This is a heavy suit specifically designed for working underwater, so it should be good enough to keep our hero safe just as long as he doesn't run out of oxygen. Unfortunately, breathing won't be his only concern, as there are all kinds of angry squids and sea spiders just waiting to crack open his protective helmet. With only flares and a knife for protection, it's safe to say that Narcosis is not an action game. One thing that really sells the experience is the way the suit handles. Your movement is slow and lacks any kind of finesse. You basically use one analog stick to control all of the movement, while using the other stick to look around the helmet. This feels noticeably different from your typical first-person game, and I like what they've done with the controls here. It's easy to get the hang of, but still limiting in a way that ratchets up the tension. And when you actually do need to make a quick getaway or jump to a tiny platform, we have a handy thrust move that'll propel you forward for a brief moment. Of course, the real star here is the underwater location, which is simultaneously haunting and gorgeous. Between the limited light and the limitations of the helmet, we're often prevented from seeing a lot of the surroundings. This only adds to the atmosphere, giving you a sense that there's something bad lurking just around the next corner, or worse, right behind you. Best of all, the setting doesn't get boring, since the game is good about letting us explore completely different locations. Even when we're forced to explore the thoroughly destroyed facilities, the developers have found a way to make each bit stand out in memorable ways. Unfortunately, there are two things about Narcosis that left me all wet. I think the biggest complaint you can level against the game is that it's entirely too linear, to the point where it sometimes feels like you're doing little more than following a narrow path. This improves as the game goes along, but I was never able to shake that feeling that I was being pulled in one direction every time. I wanted to really explore these settings and not be stuck on a linear path. My other complaint is that some of the scares become a bit too predictable after a while. A lot of it is in the character's head, which allows the developers to come up with some truly twisted and imaginative moments. But it also kneecaps some of the horror, since you know it's probably just a hallucination or something psychological. Now, when it's not trying to trick you, Narcosis will revert back to using cheap jump scares to get his point across. Honestly, I think the situation is frightening enough to not need the jump scares, and I wish the developers would have had more confidence in the story to ditch the cheap gimmicks. Being stuck underwater is plenty scary on its own. Minor complaints aside, Narcosis is an incredibly effective horror game with a great setting and premise. It also gives us superb voice acting, a killer presentation, and a few twists I didn't see coming. Best of all, it's nice to see a survival horror game with a unique setting and fresh ideas. It's definitely on the short side and often a little too linear for its own good, but Narcosis is a frighteningly fun horror game that helps shake up the genre. Hey, thanks for watching our review. So here's the question of the day. What's your favorite survival horror game? There are a lot of good ones to choose from, including a dozen Resident Evil games, the Silent Hill franchise, Alone in the Dark, or maybe something a little more obscure. I can't wait to see your picks in the comments below. In other news, I'm currently hard at work on reviews for Z-Killer and Trago, along with a big announcement coming any day now. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.